Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast.
Welcome, dear reader, to Dispatches from the Armchair.
There's so much news, and the world moves so fast. What are the big ideas and historical forces that are really shaping our world? Go deeper than the headlines with Dispatches from the Armchair.
Hello there. Welcome back to the Pacific War Channel. The channel where we cover the entire history of the Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945. And we have yet to even get close to the start of it, but here we go again.
Crawling forward.
Here with my friend
1 month at a time.
Mr. Economics, who, if he ever watched these episodes on YouTube, would realize I keep putting the stonks meme over you.
I know you do.
I keep it.
Oh, I know. It's okay.
Reiteration to the people who are listening to this on, I don't know, Podbean or whatever podcast platform you're listening to. I am on YouTube, so there is a video version of this, which is a little bit more entertaining. You get to see our ugly mugs and us sweating profusely because there's a heat wave in Quebec right now.
Yep.
It's brutal.
Yep.
And
it's kind of hot.
it's
Somebody save us. It's rare Canadians going to ask for ice, but send us some, please.
It's been a while, actually. By the time this premieres, it's quite a few weeks, and I will talk about why that's happening shortly. But just to open up, as everyone knows who's a longtime listener, these podcasts, we call them discussions, are, after the episodes that premiere on YouTube. So this episode was on the Xinhai Revolution, also known as the 1911 Revolution.
Because like you guys, I don't understand half of this historic shit, and I need a little more context. History in general is not my forte, particularly Asian history. So it's nice to delve in a little deeper and see a few things that I didn't quite get, or maybe expand on some things that you guys want to hear more about too.
And before we get into the content of this episode, I want to maybe acknowledge one rather, I'll say, very passionate commentator who got in a debate with somebody on the chat in when this episode was premiering about, in reference, if you're watching the video right now, to the little poster behind me to describe to the audience for just audio listeners. It's a 1941 poster of a map of Asia drawn up by Japan at the time. So if you look to the top right corner, if you can actually read Japanese, you would know it's basically it's slanderous propaganda by the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So the Japanese propaganda during the war, which was we'll call it fascist. It's not exactly fascist, but we'll call it fascism. So it was kind of a racial hierarchy built upon. Japan's at the top, and all the other Asian subgroups need to be beneath them because they're racially inferior to them, but they're going to control all of Asia. So this is a horrifyingly terrible propaganda tool that was used against all the Asiatic countries, including India for that matter. And Japan went about raping and murdering all these people anyway, so they didn't really buy into it.
No, to be honest, those hierarchies exist anywhere. Like, you got regular white people, and then you got rednecks. It's just,
The only way to describe it's kind of like in Canada, when we had immigration policies at the coming of the 19th century, we barred, we called them, Southern Europeans, Italians, Greeks, and all that, and we had a racial prejudice against them. They weren't, quote-unquote, full European. What was white was never fundamentally what you think of today with white skin color. Like, they thought Nordics were different people, Germans were not white at some points. It's really messed up and weird if you dwell in American history in the 1800s, for example. But anyways, this commentator, who he must be from mainland China, not to say anything about that, he saw it as being in his words, I was basically a 1940s Japanese propagandist and on par with being an actual Nazi. He said that this was as bad as like showing a swastika flag or having a KKK outfit on or something, because I was espousing like a horrible message. It's just a replica of a map. Of course, it has the co-prosperity sphere slogan on it because, yeah, it was made by Japan at that time, and everything that they made had that on it.
Well, not to mention, we're talking about events from that time period. It'd be nice to have a map that reflects that area during that time period.
I literally was using it because it's a unique part of history. I can't show it on the video, but if you've ever noticed, there's a globe here. The globe I have here is actually made in 1941 as well, and it has actually mislabelings and misspellings of countries, but it has something like, French Indochina is on here because it was made at that time, or the Kingdom of Siam because, now it's Thailand, it used to be Siam, it changes names. These are like artifacts of the time period. I am... Despite what it looks like, I'm not a 1941 Japanese fascist propagandist out to raise the morale for the Rising Sun Empire. I don't believe the Rising Sun Empire is going to come back and dominate China, as this guy might believe. I don't know. This guy, maybe language barrier. It was really like when I was looking at the comments, I understood that there was kind of a language barrier there, and he did make notice, and I want to point this out because if you're there, dude. You made one comment that bothered me. He was noting my samurai sword here, but he didn't comment on the fact I have a World War I Chinese saber that I always have presented here with the samurai sword. So I found that kind of nasty that he would point out the fact that I have a samurai sword that, quote unquote, I think he said, was used to cut off the heads of many allies and Chinese people for that instance. But I mean, like, I don't know what this guy's pointing at. These are artifacts of the war. If I had a German Luger, it doesn't mean I'm propagating the idea of executions of Allied prisoners of war during World War II. Anyways, so acknowledging that one because this guy debated with some other dude defending me in the comment section, like 10 comments each. It was pretty weird. And anyone wants to jump in there, you can jump in there. It's a fun time. I've had a lot of weird comments when it comes to this. And I thought it was important to bring this up because this subject is... I really had a hard time with this one. Talking about this one is like when it gets political. This is the founding of, and I'm going to say the T word, two countries, kind of. The things that happen here are going to result in a faction in mainland China that will eventually result in the formation of Taiwan and communist China later. This is the most arguably important moment in Chinese history. It's also called the First Revolution, whereas the real revolution, the Second Revolution, is the communist takeover of China.
Right.
Which, to each their own. I'm not here propagating any messages towards the People's Republic of China or Taiwan. I'm not taking any case. I'm just a historian telling the facts. There's no biases here. And again, to the guy who made all those claims about me having a Japanese spin on things, I've been covering Chinese history much more than the Japanese on this channel, and I've been pretty sympathetic towards the Chinese cause, I found. And it's not hard to do so. The Japanese were pretty malicious at this time period. It's hard to be on their side, quote unquote. So yeah. At least that's out of the way. So we'll get on to the actual subject matter, which is...
And let's not forget, you've also been accused of going against the Japanese when it came to your atrocities video, and...
oh god, yeah.
So it's, I mean, if you're against Japanese and Chinese, well...
I guess I'm, I don't know, a double agent for the Rising Sun Empire.
That must be it.
Yeah, so people are probably like, what the hell's going on with this podcast? But, so getting back to the subject matter, sometimes in the past I've actually summarized the event, but I really don't want to do that anymore because go watch the episode, and this one's so complicated, as you already know. While
my brain still hurts, which is why we're here, because I need a little bit of clarification on this one.
To maybe summarize a little bit about this channel, we were covering from the beginning 1830s China, all the main events that begins this 100 years of humiliation. So we're talking about the first Opium War, we got the second Opium War, we got the Taiping Rebellion that kills an unbelievable amount of people.
Sino-Japanese War.
First Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Russo-Japanese War, which you think doesn't have much to do with China, but they fought inside China. It actually affected China greatly and hurt them economically if you think about it, and they lost a lot of territory, and it was another, it's insulting that people are fighting on your land and then inevitably you lose more territory to them. It's pretty mind-boggling.
Yep.
But the Xinhai Revolution it embodies the collapse finally of the Qing Dynasty.
Which we've said in about 12 episodes so far, but there's a reason why they call it the 100 Years. It's because it's been slowly crumbling for a while, and now it's finally falling off the cliff.
And boy, it's not like the exact falling off the cliff you would think in all the histories of things that happen in the world. It wasn't one revolution for that matter. To kind of count, it's about 37 different uprisings, of which there's actually other countries that form resistance movements and break off of what is called China at that time. Like there's a Tibetan uprising, a Mongolian one. There's many, many different groups that tried to break off. And it happens over the course of many, many years, despite the fact we do know it as the 1911 revolution that is in reference to kind of the big one that put the nail in the coffin. But the Qing Dynasty lasted for, I gotta read this, 276 years.
Yeah.
And imperial rule in China had lasted for 2,132 years in total. So this was breaking, if you think about it, history that goes back to ancient times. It's actually pretty it's crazy. And it's a moment in time where so many things happen that it gets so complicated that I honestly couldn't dedicate the whole episode to going into it. I chose intentionally to be more vague and to brutally summarize it. I think the episode was only about 14 minutes or something.
Yeah,
and I did that.
It was a short one, but it's difficult when you're spamming all that information and trying to figure out who's who and what's what. But it seems to me like there was kind of a main protagonist in this that you talked about quite a bit, although I don't remember his name.
Dr. Sun Yat-Sen.
Yeah.
He
is a Chinese Hawaiian doctor, which you're going to have to explain that one to me.
Or he himself is not Hawaiian. He had family that was in Honolulu who, one of them was a very rich landowner who was one of the main donors to the cause, actually. He donated a lot of his produce to the cause. It's funny to say that the foundations of the revolutions was, as you would imagine, built on funding. Because you can't have an uprising without certain things, and financial funding was necessary. And if you think about it, one of the most influential people in human history, he was basically the finance guy. He was the guy who was fighting to do fundraisers the entire time. And I don't really go into it so much in the episode, but it's pretty crazy when you go into how he funded all of this. And I did a lot of research to try and showcase the nitty-bitty information and kind of the weird nature of dirty things he had to do to get this money, which I found really interesting, which maybe people aren't so knowledgeable about, because if you hear, Sun Yat-Sen, you immediately, what comes to mind is, he's this guy who starts the Great Revolution that brings down the Qing Dynasty, and then it's all stolen from him. In the episode, we mentioned that the guy that's been mentioned many times, Yuan Shikai, this great military general, he is in a position where he controls the military of this fragmented small pocket of China, because China's really breaking at this point. And the Qing Dynasty, they have a little toddler as an emperor at this point, Puyi. And there's nothing they can do. The army will listen to Yuan Shikai because he's a proven leader, and he controls already the strongest part of the military in the first place. So when they're putting down what is the rebellion at this point, he could easily quell it. But he chooses to play both sides. As I say in the episode, the imperial court and the royal family they're saying to him, okay, can you suppress, the rebels, let's stop this. And he tells them, I don't have the necessary artillery, I can't seem to do it, it's taking longer. And he's lying. And then what he's really doing is he's negotiating with the rebels because he's
Of course.
trying
he's,
to see.
He's playing both sides of the fence, trying to see one who will come out on top because he can influence that directly.
Exactly.
And figuring out which one he's going to be better off with in the long run, which is...
And it works completely in his favor, as anyone who knows the story. Yuan Shikai is kind of a villain, I would say, to most mainland Chinese. Well, after this event, before I would argue he's kind of a hero. He did a lot for China before. You can't argue that the guy didn't do stuff, for China, because he led for a very long time these militaries. I mean, he's almost, he's not on par with Li Hongzhang, but he's under him a little bit. But he ends up negotiating with the rebels, and he gets, the emperor to abdicate and to take over, and they have a free election. Sun Yat-Sen is elected by, the group to be the first president of this new republic, and Yuan Shikai just has a fit. He does what he has to do to get rid of Sun Yat-Sen. He takes it for himself, and then he pulls the old kind of Hitler-esque move of gaining power, and he becomes a dictator, and that's not enough. Then he says, well, screw it, let's make up a position. I'm the emperor, and he makes his own royal family, and he just dies. Right in the midst of it, leaving a more fractured China, which is now run by all these regional warlords that he put into position, because he could control them, arguably. He probably had a system of controlling these people, and then he dies, and now China is literally in the warlord period, where there's nothing. There is a quote-unquote republic, but no, not really. It's not really in charge. And actually, someone mentioned in the comments, my thumbnails, I put flags on them on the videos, and I had put the Beiyang, the Republic of China flag, which is the 5 colors of the 5 different peoples of China, and behind it is the Qing Dynasty. And I think the guy was angry because I didn't put the Kuomintang flag, the blue with the white sun, which represents Sun Yat-sen's party. And anyways, I didn't want to be political, so I was just putting it in chronological order to that guy in the audience. The only purpose of putting the flags the way I did is because I'm covering a few years after this event, and technically China becomes the Republic of China, as we know, and that's why I use that flag. And I didn't want to make a political statement because YouTube doesn't like that. And YouTube's probably not going to like this episode because it talks about politics in China. Not good.
Well, gotta cover it at some point, but...
Yeah, this episode, I was dreading doing this episode because I've said it multiple times, very, very knowledgeable of Japanese history, particularly in the Pacific War or the 19th century, 20th century for that matter. China, I've had to learn on the go, and I've done great efforts to learn everything I could. But when it came to this event, my God, I had the work cut out for me. I had to read an entire book to try and really grasp it, and that covered so many different uprisings simultaneously that I didn't talk about in this episode. There's no way I could. There's 37 of them. And they're notching, like if the wall of China is there, all these little uprisings are just breaking it piece by piece, and it really collectively made it crumble. But as I said in the episode, ironically, the uprising that finally broke them was one that Sun Yat-sen was not kind of part of. It was a revolt against some railroads being built that angered people in the Shandong area, and Sun Yat-sen got caught with his pants down because the revolution started, and he had to rush over, so it was kind of funny.
But Sun Yat-sen in general, he was part of at least 10 or a dozen of these revolutions, I think.
Yeah, I coined it to about 10 out of the 37 he directly was, funding. Because that was honestly what he was doing the whole time, was he was going, he was in exile most of the time in different countries like Canada, United States, Japan mostly. The truth is, he presented himself a lot of the times as a Japanese person, which is heinous thing to say, I guess, at this point, but it's true. The Japanese had very nefarious reasons to support him, and they are the main backers of this. So financially, he had to raise funds around the world, and he did it in really some weird ways involving mafias and stuff. For instance, the Black Dragon Society in China wanted to support him because they thought if they weakened the government enough of China and broke the Qing Dynasty, that it would leave Manchuria open, which, as I've said in multiple episodes, Japan's
very big money area. But
Japan's top priority has always been to take Manchuria. So the Black Dragon Society was working with another society called the Yakuza, because they had a interest in not only securing Manchuria but opening up an opium trade there. Ironically,
Yeah.
so it all goes back to
we know
opium.
China does well with opium.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, if you look back in history in general, there's a lot of times where countries are a little bit chaotic. There's uprisings, wars, things like that. And in many, many cases, the ruling power or the overthrowing one are always going to make deals with
Yeah, of course.
either mafias or underground figures or stuff like that, because a lot of times they control the money. And also, they have more power than a lot of people give them credit for. In terms of trade, in terms of travel, in terms of access, supplies, weapons,
It's funny you
all these
mentioned
things,
that.
especially in those days. So,
It's funny you mentioned that because when it came to the overseas traveling, setting up of fundraising events and everything in Canada particularly, Sun Yat-sen's contacts who helped him enormously overseas were the triads. So we have all the main kind of mafias in the
Yeah.
world that exist till today that were helping him out. And it actually, I was reading about it because I didn't know much myself. It turns out the triads did a lot. They put people in seats at these fundraisers. I mean, they put a lot of people in stadiums to make it seem more packed, to get more people to show up. Like, they did everything. And Sun Yat-sen, he did everything you can think of to raise money. I mean, he would pay, he would say, I'm going to sell bonds at like $10, for instance. And
Yeah.
when you redeem them, when the Republic is formed, will be worth $100 to you. Or if someone was extremely wealthy, he would say, I will give you exclusive mining rights in China because I will be the president of this new republic, and
Yeah.
we're going to give you extraterritoriality and
Of
you get
course.
money.
well, it's the same idea as the U.S. selling war bonds and stuff. I mean, the U.S. fundraising for World War I and World War II was just massive.
And
People who didn't have money were putting money into this. One, on the chance of making some, but two, if you can sell the cause, people will always put their money in. Doesn't matter what it is.
I do have, it was not easy to find literal figures on the money, but I did find sporadic things from different places where he was getting this money. And it really depends on the time and place, but he could be, where was it? I had one place. Yeah, in Hong Kong. And it's one of the early days of his fundraising in 1895, so this is very early. He was selling shares at about $10 silver value with an expected return of $100. In 1905, he raised over $2 million in Singapore by selling bonds at $250 each with the expectation of $1,000 back, of which many of these people did not get their money, by the way.
Yeah.
But that goes without saying.
And it's you have to take into account one of the main reasons why you had to do so much fundraising overseas rather than in mainland China is, one, again, China very fractured. So when you have so many different groups all looking out for themselves, it's hard to rally as many to your cause. But the other thing is, during the Qing Dynasty, China was still very much into, one of the main support of their economy was all farmland.
Yeah.
Over 80% of the population lived in farmland, out in the country. These weren't wealthy people for the most part. Obviously, you had the aristocracy or the higher ups, but at the end of the day, when 80% of your population doesn't have that money, you got to go somewhere else to get it, especially if you need a lot of it very fast. Rather than nickel and diming farmers for $1 a piece or 50 cents a piece, he goes to the bigwigs and looks for hundreds or thousands.
Yep.
So that took him overseas, and it's only after the Republic of China was formed that they really started to industrialize, and I'm sure we'll get into that in some future episodes, or try to industrialize, so to speak.
It's
But,
so the particularly in the period you can't even talk because in the World War One, this is
From
still
like
hitting the
15
fan.
to 37,
Yeah,
a lot of things are happening in China, and I'm actually going to do some research when we get into that period specifically. But
because Yuan Shikai, he dies he dies like at the offset of World War One, and it's like China is in such it's a disaster. Mm-hmm. And then in the 1920s, they kind of get their legs a little bit, and they form. And politically, there's the party that Sun Yat-sen eventually founds, because in this whole episode he starts off with this revived China society. It merges, evolves into Tongmenghui, And then that emerges and becomes the Kuomintang, which we know even to today. I mean, it has origins that go all the way into Taiwan to today. And there's all sorts of political stuff that could be said about that, but I am not an expert on that, nor do I want to even talk about it. I mean, as far as the Second Sino-Japanese War is concerned, I can talk about anything the KMT does, but I don't want to go into the greater politics of it, nor do I want to go into the Chinese Civil War necessarily that's going to spring from this as well, because later in the future, the communists will rise, and then they're going to butt heads with what is the Nationalist Party that was finding its foundations here, and it's so much more confusing than that. As you can imagine, you've probably heard the name Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek.
Yep.
They both were inspired by Sun Yat-Sen. Chiang Kai-shek was actually under Sun Yat-Sen. He was in his party and helped him. In one of the uprisings, Chiang Kai-shek fought, I believe, if not, I don't know if he did physical combat. I think he did. And yeah, so this is the foundation of just so much history. And before it is so much history. I mean, this is the leading up to the big crumbling of the Qing Dynasty as we know it. And it did go out with a bang. I mean, it's kind of weird how Empress Dowager she's on her deathbed and she, quote unquote, allegedly poisons, the emperor the day after so he can't.
It is a bit of a coincidence, but, we can only speculate as to that.
Yeah. Funny fact, J.P. Morgan was approached as one of the main donors for all this. They were trying to get $10 million out of him, but I don't think I have the quote here, but I remember it goes something like, he was already dealing with a nation at the moment, and they were talking about building another one. He said, why would I bother? I'm already making money. So he didn't go for it. Yeah. That's just a big name amongst many others. It was overseas Chinese people that were kind of the big backers financially that really brought this. And I mean from the peasant in the field to someone with a big business. There was one story, I think it was a guy from possibly Southeast Asia or even the Philippines. He gave his life savings, and it amounted to not much, and it's just one of those stories where he believed so much in the cause because he had been from mainland China.
Like I said, if you can sell the cause,
yeah, they did.
It's going to happen, but that's why most of these people who weren't living in mainland China anymore, obviously they're not living in that fractured society, not knowing who to pay taxes up to, not knowing what's going on. Everything was a bit in shambles, and there wasn't as much money to be made, whereas those who left the country and went elsewhere, be it overseas to the Americas, to Europe, to wherever, I have a feeling they were making a much better living, which is why they could donate so much more.
Yeah, and it was rough being overseas because you have to imagine this is, particularly for the United States and Canada, there's anti-immigration acts, like the Chinese head tax, for example, was happening. I think Chiang Kai-shek had to present himself probably as a Japanese guy a few times just to go to some of these places because, there's all sorts of barriers to stop him from entering certain countries, even though he was I think he was a very liked person. I mean, he was a very good public speaker. That's how he pulled this off. So people were enthusiastic about seeing him, and he even made a presence in Europe. It's not talked about as much as North America, but he was in Europe as well, and I don't know, maybe he didn't receive as much funding. Most of the money, from what I can tell, did come from Southeast Asia, and he almost got a ton of money from the Philippines, but it was what we would call a dirty transaction. What he was doing was he was trying to be the middleman to get arms from Japan to the Philippines, which would have been used to attack the Americans who were occupying it. So that didn't go well. And he would have, I don't know if he got the money, he would have received $100,000 for this whole ordeal. So it was money for the cause, and he put everything into the cause. This guy did not pocket it by any means at all. And I present it almost like it's kind of hard to, it's weird to say bloodless. It wasn't a bloodless conflict. It's really hard to gauge because it's not one uprising, it's 37. If you went on Wikipedia, the number they give you, it's like they're estimating 170,000 casualties for the Qing military and about 50,000 for the revolutionaries. But those are casualties. That doesn't actually tell you deaths, and it doesn't tell you the executions of civilians and all the horrible stuff that was probably occurring. So I would imagine maybe like 100,000 people probably died. That's just me ballparking a number. But I mean, in Chinese history, look at anything, the Taiping Rebellion, like the death toll of that is absolutely insane, and we're not taught about that in the Western world, and it rivals like World War One.
Yeah. But that's it, and you have all of these small rebellions going on everywhere, and it goes back to what we've talked about before, where you have a nation so divided, and now all of a sudden they're getting hit all over the map, and it's one after another, just little, just little pecks at the armor here and there.
And
But the dynasty finally collapses. Qing Dynasty is over.
And now there's that awkward period, and I won't reiterate or summarize. In the episode, you see that they go through this whole political conflict where they're trying to elect leaders. And inevitably this republic forms, but then the guy who starts the republic and gets dictatorial powers, he's number one, Generalissimo, Yuan Shikai. He decides it's not enough, and he wants to be an emperor, and he dies not too long after. And then it just completely crumbles. And what you see for the next while is there is a nationalist government in charge of the republic, but the republic is a few provinces in kind of central China, whereas like a place, let's say like Manchuria, is fully controlled now by a warlord.
Right.
It's pretty much independent. And to use that example, the guy who's in charge of Manchuria eventually, he doesn't see eye to eye with the Republic of China for most part.
So he just does whatever he wants in the meantime.
And he's off fighting the Soviets or the Japanese. And he still doesn't see eye to eye with the nationalists. So it's an awkward situation. You have everybody who has their own needs. Like the Mongolians might want they don't want to be part of this. They're getting attacked by the Soviets and occupied and all that stuff. Even the Japanese occupy them at some point. Got Tibetans. Today, that's a hot button issue. There's all sorts of groups. Because China is not just a place with one type of people. There's multiple ethnic groups.
Very diverse. Now, at what point do they finally start to rally all that together into the quote-unquote republic?
Even that's hard to say. So there's going to be a civil war between the communists and what is the party that Sun Yat-Sen kind of started here, the Kuomintang. We're going to call them the Nationalist Party. There's a civil war. The Nationalists kind of they basically will say they win the day, and the communists are pushed off, but they're not dead. When they're pushed off in the late 20s, this nationalist republic, they're basically facing the behemoth that is the Japanese Empire, because the Japanese are just they're salivating watching this.
This is the time period where they just dwarf China.
Well, if China was united, it would be another story, but Japan sees just a bunch of stakes in front of them that are not fighting together and says, I really want Manchuria. And as we will see in like 1931, they're going to get their hands into Manchuria, do a lot of illegal, terrible stuff, take it, and they're going to get hungrier and hungrier and keep taking more and more areas and do horrendous stuff, really terrible stuff. And it's a whole other can of worms to open, but that's going to be the future of this. I think for the purposes of this episode, though, maybe we'll talk about the future of this channel and why it took so long to make this podcast, which I can publicly talk about now, because finally the word is out if the audience doesn't already know. But to start off with, what's going to be coming after this episode is going to be I won't call it a 4-part, like a part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4 thing. It's going to be a 4 different episode series on World War I in Asia, which are their own episodes, because YouTube doesn't like parted videos. That's why I'm actually doing it. And I've already finished all 4 scripts, and I've edited 2 of the first episodes. They're done, ready to go. I can name them right now. The first one is going to be the the Siege of Tsingtao. Good beer, by the way. The second one is going to be German raiders in the Pacific. The third one will be China in World War I, so it's an overall of everything that happens with China. And the fourth one will be Japan during World War I, so everything that involves Japan. There's some overlapping, although I'm not obnoxious about it. I really try to keep the subjects different from each other. And honestly, when you look at World War I in Asia, a huge chunk is actually the Siege of Tsingtao. And once you get rid of that, it comes together pretty beautifully after. And there's a lot of German stuff in this one, and I actually enjoyed that because it's words I can pronounce.
I'll reserve judgment on that, but
Ich,
I have a feeling there's going to be a few angry Germans in the chat. in the comments after
Nein,
this.
nein.
But
Meine Deutsch ist nicht so gut, aber ich möchte Deutsch sprechen.
But what was I gonna say? Yeah, but we're finally coming up to the time period of the actual Pacific War.
It's gonna
Slowly.
come up quick.
Slowly.
But the reason why it's slowing down, as maybe some of the longtime viewers will notice, because there's a huge gap between this podcast and the episode, and usually it's been every single week. I've managed to keep this kind of deadline. Some of you probably already know I've been working with another YouTube company. It's Kings and Generals, and at this point, 2 episodes have come out that I wrote the scripts for. The first one was the Battle of Taranto. The second one is the defense of Xinhai Warehouse, which was interesting because I did a review of the 800 movie on this channel, which is doing very well. A lot of people like the episode, so I had already learned the actual history to do the episode. So when Kings and Generals was approaching me for ideas, I said this would be a great video to do, and the animator who worked with me, an outstanding guy from Germany, he did a whole 3D rendition. I really go watch the episode. It's Kings and Generals YouTube channel, Defense of Xinhai Warehouse. It's awesome. I think it's one of the first videos that even does this battle. I don't know if anybody has done it on YouTube before. But in greater news, Kings and Generals has finally announced a project that's coming out, and that's the Pacific War series. So, as you can imagine, they approached a lot of people, and the Pacific War channel was one of them. So I will be working with them in the upcoming future, and I can't say much more than that. But since they finally announced it's coming out, I will be part of this. And it's going to be a huge, huge ride. I can attest to months of work have gone into this, and I am spending every day working on stuff. It's going to be really cool, and it doesn't mean the end of my channel. It just means my channel is going to take a lot longer, and I'm probably going to change a lot of the direction of my channel. Because as far as this podcast is concerned, it's we're going to see what we're going to do. But going forward, I'm bouncing
He
off
doesn't
one.
like me anymore.
Yeah, that's it. But please do check them out. Unless they're not your cup of tea, in which just come back to me, hopefully. But yeah, they're great. Love them. Love their work. I've been watching them for years. And they have so many good guys behind them. It's a pleasure working with them right now. That covers a lot of that. God, you know what? During this point, let's bring up the future of this channel a little bit. So we're going to be doing the 4-part series on World War One. Then
What about the second Sino-Japanese War?
So that's going to kick off in 37, although some people even argue 31. Between that is actually going to be kind of interesting. I'm having a hard time visualizing what to cover between, like, we're going to call it World War One to 1937. There should be episodes in between, but they're going to be boring for a lot of audience members because a lot of audience members don't want to hear about the politics or, like, the small conflicts. Like, you can talk about the warlord era of China, and there's literally a bunch of battles every single year where different regional warlords are fighting over and consolidating their power positions. And even Japan is involved in a lot of these, but it's not very interesting, I think, for the general, like, audiences. And there's a lot of guys who've done this way back when, probably speaking Mandarin, do a much better job than I ever could because I'm not fundamentally strong in Chinese history. But I figure I'll do at least one major episode on the history of China, one on the politics and what is called the government of assassination of Japan, because you have to cover that, because Japan just goes through, like, the most brutal time with people getting assassinated left, right, and center, and the military just basically takes control. I could even do an episode speaking about more recent information that's come to the public about the involvement of Emperor Hirohito and how he was controlling a lot of things that were going on in Japan, despite a lot of us being told for, like, 70 years at this point that he wasn't, and that he was kind of a hostage. Could even make episodes on Southeast Asia countries, or a country like the Philippines. I know I have a lot of Filipino viewers who've been talking about when are you going to cover, the great battles of the Philippines, because when you talk the Pacific War, like, the the invasion of the Philippines and the retaking, it's a huge part of it. It's very, very interesting. A lot of horrible stuff happens in the Philippines. It's brutal. But we're going to see. I'm bouncing off all the other work I'm doing for the other YouTube channel, too. And I don't want to steal from what they're doing by any means. I want to be my own thing. And I think for the most part, this channel will always focus on a chronological order, event by event. And that's just the way to go about it. And I might have special episodes that talk about, unique things that people don't know. Like, I've always thought once the Second Sino-Japanese War really kicks off, or the Pacific War in general, I wanted to talk about things people would never think of. Like, one of the biggest reasons why the American forces won in Pacific Island warfare was because of food. MRE rations over what the Japanese had, if they even had food on these islands. It had a huge effect on the battles.
There's actual full YouTube channels dedicated to MREs right now.
Yeah,
they
they're
taste them, they try them out, they talk about the history of them. It's that's like a small niche branch of something, but it's an interesting history.
You would never think about it, but the influence, because people who know the Pacific War know that the Japanese were basically starving on these islands. They were sent there. Their troop ships would get hit before they even get there, so they would show up without supplies, and the Japanese forces would spend most of their time foraging for food. But for those who even had food, you have to imagine this. They were literally lugging like bags of rice on their back. So the Americans, in comparison, have these MREs. You open them up and you eat them, right? If you're a Japanese guy, you have to cook whatever you're carrying, and at night that means you're lighting a fire. Lighting a fire at night means you can get shot by a sniper. So this had a huge effect. You think it's like kind of a joke, but no, it's crazy. Like,
not just that, but less time consuming. You can eat and move. You can do.
Yeah, I had a professor who talked about the equipment and how that had an effect on all the different, combatants of World War II. Fun fact, the Japanese had the heaviest rifle and the largest bayonet on the rifle out of all the soldiers of the Pacific War, and they were arguably the smallest guys. So lugging that around while marching had an effect. Like, they were really struggling, and they were underfed, malnourished. Lucky if they got to the island, I guess. Unlucky to be on the island, because they would probably starve to death or die of malaria, because most people on these Pacific Islands just died of disease. And the actual horrible insects, freaking snakes, and whatever else is on the island. Like, this is one of the most horrifying wars in human history. And I had a guy ask me to try and describe to him why we don't know so much about the Pacific War compared to World War II in Europe. And I told him, because I remember this was a great quote from some book, and it said, the Pacific War is not a clean war. It's really ugly. And that's the truth of it. When they were writing the history books of, heroism and everything, and they look at Europe and they're like, oh yeah, good versus evil, the Nazis were quelled, and they love that. And then they look at the Pacific War and it's full of racism, atrocities by both sides, mostly people dying of starvation, disease, horrifying stuff with the worst mutilation stories you've ever heard, like stuff you can't even see on YouTube. It's terrifyingly bad. And you just didn't see that in other battlefields. And,
well, the truth of it is, it doesn't matter what war you look at, each side has a perspective. And each side sees themselves to be, quote-unquote, the good guy, if you want to put it that black and white. But when it comes to the Pacific War, none of the motivations were that malicious, I don't think.
It's... Oh, God.
Not malicious in the sense of wanting to take over a lesser race or, I think it was just more the fact of keeping your country, your nation, your heritage alive, especially for the Chinese, but also for the Japanese who were overshadowed by them for so long.
This is why that guy was screaming at me in the comment section. The Japanese...
That's an opinion, I think it's...
No, the Japanese, they eventually, they really did drink the Kool-Aid. Mm-hmm. Like, to be honest, Hideki Tojo, which is like the dictator, we'll call him in Japan, the main guy, he was a follower of Nazi rhetoric. He read, like, Mein Kampf most likely, and he followed a lot of the Nazi propaganda, and he tried to incorporate it, not just him, mind you, a lot of people in Japan, the political sphere, they were trying to be like that, because that was, I'll call it, that was being cool, kind of, like that was seen as, it was an effective way to control it, and the greater East Asia prosperity sphere that the guy went on about against me, over here behind me, like that's a product of it. They tried to have a racial hierarchy, and they were trying to say to the Asian people, like, you're better off under us because the white man has been dominating you. And if you think about it, this is very effective. This would have worked. A lot of people would argue that if the Japanese actually walked the walk instead of just talking about it, it would have worked. But in what really happened was, while they're saying all this great stuff about a big Asian collective, they raped and butchered and murdered all these Asian nations and did horrible things, particularly to China. So it didn't really work, the propaganda, because they acted like horrifying barbarians a lot of the time. And you have things like the rape in Nanking and stuff.
Well, let's not forget too, we've talked about it in other episodes, if Japan were to get a little big for its britches and try to go after the whole pie, so to speak, we've said before that I think Russia would have stepped in and put a stop to that, because they were the sleeping bear next to them.
Yeah, well, like I think I've said it multiple times in podcasts, and it's always a great shock to Americans, because Americans today it's different. The history, even in high school, it's being changed, but the narrative has always been that America dropped the A-bombs on Japan, and then it forced the surrender of the Japanese forces, and then it ended the war. When it's not true, and it's not like an argument really anymore. If you read the actual literature, the Soviet Union invading Manchuria at the last days of the war did cause the Japanese to surrender. The Japanese were in a period of weeks upon which they were looking for the best deal, so to say. And the Soviets had not breached a neutrality pact with them, so they were technically not at war. And it's a very confusing thing, and it actually goes by the hour, because there's meetings that are held between the two bombs dropping, and that's what's really apparent as to why they surrendered. But when the Russians, the Soviet Union, did invade and they took over Manchuria, and they completely bulldozed them. It was the last hope of any chance.
Japan realized they couldn't fight USA on one side and Russia on the other. It just wouldn't have been a thing.
And again, it's hard for especially like people in the Western world to understand that Manchuria was more of a priority than any Pacific island at this point, because it was the lifeblood of Japan. Like, their entire economy was built off Manchuria, because when you invest into an area for this long, everything is bound to it. So when the Russians did that, like, it threatened the most important part of Japan, and they were looking to secure as much of what they had gained over the years as they could, because they knew by the end of 43 that Japan knew, all leaders knew they were done. Like, they were done. And anyways, this is a whole can of worms. A lot of Americans probably going to get angry and comment after this.
Probably.
But you know what? If the Americans want to hear something, were the atomic bombs necessary? Yes. Not for the surrender of Japan. They were necessary to stop the Soviet Union from taking Japan. Because a lot of arguments can be made that Nagasaki's bomb in particular was dropped just to kind of threaten the Soviets and to stop them from going any further, at which they eventually stopped on the parallel in North Korea.
Because once they decided to go and took Manchuria, there's nothing to say they couldn't have tried to keep steamrolling the whole
They went all the way to Korea.
Yeah.
And the number one Japanese army that sat around doing nothing throughout the entire war was sitting in northern Manchuria in case the Soviets attacked. And they were just bulldozed. Nothing.
Didn't even phase.
It's crazy how bad it was. But anyways, we went really off topic. This was on the Xinhai Revolution, and finally there was a Republic of China, and it's looking still depressing. It's still depressing. The 100 years of humiliation are still going to happen, mind you.
Well, I mean, we're in the early 1900s now. We're right before World War One. It's we're getting interesting.
I'll finish off with this. For audience members from mainland China, I really try to hit stuff that people don't talk about when it comes to World War One in China, because if you know the history on, you would think it's the 21 demands and stuff, and more humiliation, more terrible things happening to the Chinese people. I actually tried to think more outside the box, and I found a lot of interesting stuff that has to deal with, the Civil War in Russia and Chinese laborers on the Western Front and Eastern Front, who were kind of the guys breaking their backs, doing the work in the back scenes, because the country remained neutral and couldn't technically bring soldiers to the Western Front, but they were there in numbers. So it's an interesting story, and China played its part. So, yeah. I think that's good enough.
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, we're getting into a really interesting time period. A lot of stuff's going to kick off, but here, why don't we end with a quiz? I'm going to quiz you about this time period and see if I know something you don't. Self-proclaimed expert on history and naval battles and all these things, right?
Alright.
What ship was sunk in the early 1900s that had the most casualties?
Early 1900s. God, I don't know. I'm thinking...
Mr. Expert with your Battle of Midway and all this.
I don't know. It's the most casualties.
No Googling. Don't touch that laptop.
Is this during
Come on,
a war?
see, I'm stumping the historian here.
Is this during a war?
Huh?
This is before World War II.
Yes, I'll give you that.
Oh my god.
Do I need Ian here, the expert on the Yamato and all these other ships?
I would assume it's like a German... Well, I don't know.
I'll tell you what, I'll even sweeten the pot a little bit. You don't have to give me the name of the ship. Just give me where it was from. Not necessarily where it was built, but where it was going from or something like that.
Britain?
You think Britain?
Sure.
Trick question. Was it Titanic?
I knew it was gonna be the Titanic. They didn't have that
Easy.
many they didn't have that many dead. A lot of people got rescued though.
A lot of, like 12.
No, a lot of people got rescued. They didn't all that's not like the movie.
Yeah, I'm aware.
Okay, we're not gonna talk about the Titanic.
I'm just saying.
Okay, we're gonna end off.
Easy trick question.
This has been the Pacific War Channel, and there was more than enough room on the door for both Jack and Rose to survive. Boom.